Thank you very much, Khadijah. I call this Transforming Painful Memories, Assisting Escapes, Preserving Community, Founding a Church, a Black woman's leadership, Black Indian woman's leadership, in the person of Humboldt's Aunt Polly Crosby. And I think it may not be so rare that really important streams of history unite in the story of one place or one institution, even one person. And yet that special convergence may really remain obscure for later busy generations who are not very interested or perhaps not trained to poke around in the shadows of a forgotten history. But poke we should, for what we may find may help us to understand the currents that have channeled us together and that really continue to move us along. Those currents did come together to help consolidate a community of importance to African Americans and Native Americans, a community that is now somewhat dissipated, but it is still there. And the currents themselves have taken many new turns, united with other streams, and have produced some challenges that definitely are still important. The place I have in mind is Humboldt, Kansas. The institution is now called the Poplar Grove Baptist Church, and the person is, quote, Aunt Polly Crosslin, also known as Aunt Polly Crosby. But for most people, their Aunt Polly was enough. The congregation of the Poplar Grove Baptist Church was the embodiment of the colored community of Humboldt and has been for over 150 years. Its buildings have never been imposing, and I'll show you at the end some photos of the present building, but they first met in a log cabin, in Aunt Polly's log cabin, then in a hayloft nearby, then in a small cottage that actually subsequently burned, and now in a modest structure in need of repair. My grandmother, Gertrude Stovall, recorded stories she had heard of gatherings at the log cabin of one person they always called Aunt Polly Crosby, where formerly enslaved friends prayed together, recounted their ordeals, bared to each other their scars from the days of slavery, and steeled their resolve. Those meetings must have started soon after, or perhaps even still during, the Civil War. The history of the Poplar Grove Baptist Church, written in March of 1962 by my grandmother, Stovall, stated that the church congregation itself grew out of those meetings in Polly's cabin. However, one Reverend D.D. Payne is officially credited to be the organizer of the church, and I think that, maybe because he was a male, and they weren't going to give a female credit at that time, and maybe even since, for having really organized that church. He was its first official pastor. More importantly, however, was the leadership in the first organizing of the community out of which that church arose, and that leadership came from Aunt Polly. Several official founding members of the later church were Indians or spouses of Indians, and indeed, I think that the wife of D.D. Payne himself was an Indian, or a former slave of an Indian, as Aunt Polly herself was. So the momentous streams of history that flow together in this story are these, starting with the 1830s and 40s and the Trails of Tears, over which tens of thousands of Native Americans, along with their African family members, as well as their enslaved Africans in the so-called 5 civilized tribes, were forced to march many hundreds of miles to Indian Territory, which we now, of course, call Oklahoma. Then there's the 1861-62 Great Escape of many, many, many thousands of these Indians and blacks that fled the Confederacy, which had now taken control of Indian Territory, and fled into Kansas over the Trail of Blood on Ice. That was led by the great Creek Indian leader, Abithiyohola. Then there are the first colored soldiers to fight for the Union in the Civil War in the mid-1862, in the Indian Home Guards and in the Kansas Colored Regiments, and both had both Indians and blacks in it. And one of them was Aunt Polly's husband, the Seminole interpreter Edmund Guess, and her nephew, Andrew Cumsey. The first colored officers among these soldiers were legendary Seminole personages. In one case, Halleck Tustanegee, perhaps one of the closest associates of Osceola, and one of the best known of the Seminole Indian warriors, and Billy Bowlegs, also an associate of Osceola, also well known as a warrior, perhaps less well known than Halleck Tustanegee. Those two became the first colored officers fighting for the Union in the first Indian Home Guards. Cumsey's wife was one of the founders, together with Polly Crosby and the wife of D.D. Payne and my own great-great-grandmother, Lucy Davis. A colored woman who not only brought together Indians and blacks into prayerful meetings of remembrance, but who also dared to harbor and assist persons to escape from enslavement. And then there's the formation of a community of believers that organized themselves for lasting progress in the church for their common colored community. That's what Aunt Polly was. Descendants who may now wonder if they can claim any of the presumed benefits of ancestors who were once full citizens of these Native Americans may be perplexed at the turn of events now where those tribes have moved to try to expel them. But Aunt Polly and her cabin served not only as the place where they organized that community, but they also later discovered tunnels leading from the nearby riverbank right up to her yard and perhaps right into her cabin. And so she's thought, together with another personage in Humboldt, to have been one of the two prominent Underground Railroad stations for people escaping from Missouri and from Indian Territory, coming up the Neosho River Valley and able to get into her cabin. And Aunt Polly was a well-known personage in Humboldt throughout the latter half of the 19th century after the Civil War. She appears in several people's notes and diaries, and in various newspaper accounts, and even in the U.S. Census records, but oddly enough under a variety of names. She's there as Polly Crosslin, Crossyland, Crosslin, Crosslee, Crossy Bayan, as well as Crosby, with varying origins and ages, but with that same distinctive persona. She had been enslaved as a member of either the Creek or the Seminole nations. Her husband, Edmund Guest, also known as Uncle Toby Crosslin, was an interpreter in the Seminole languages, which of course are related to much of the Creek Indians. The Creeks were divided between Muskogee speakers and Hitchiti speakers, and the Seminoles derived mostly from the Hitchiti speakers, as was Abifliahoa. She and Edmund were married in a ceremony performed by one of the most famous Black Creek Indian pastors, Mundy Durant, who appears in any number of historical accounts for the Creeks and the Black Creeks. And he lived for a time in Humboldt. And as I said, he's the one who performed the marriage for Aunt Polly and her husband Edmund. As I've mentioned, Edmund and Polly's nephew, Andrew Cumsey, were soldiers in that first Indian Home Guards regiment. Later, Cumsey's wife was one of the official founding members of the church that D.D. Payne's wife, May, was also a founding member of, and she too was very likely an Indian. The Indian Home Guards, by the way, were organized in Leroy, Kansas, not terribly far from Humboldt. But they were outfitted and encamped in Humboldt on their way to the very first expedition into Missouri, and that was one of the first points of engagement between soldiers fighting for the Union and Confederate troops. Their camp was later named Logtown, and even later than that, the Park for Coloreds in the town of Humboldt. And it was very near Polly's cabin, and excuse me, later, near the home of my grandmother, the Stovalls. Also, the significance of Aunt Polly's cabin later obtained some recognition in local newspaper accounts when one of these several tunnels that I mentioned near the nearby bluffs of the Neosha River were found to end at a trapdoor in the floor of her yard or in her cabin. So that's how we know from later newspaper accounts that this very likely served as an underground railroad station. And we know that the town of Humboldt was a very prominent anti-slavery town. And in fact, it was twice raided and once nearly completely burned down by Confederate troops in response to their role as anti-slavery forces in Kansas. Decades later, the present structure of the church, the Poplar Grove Church, was built by my own grandfather, Reverend James Stovall, and he is indeed the grandfather of Chester Jr., who is sitting there in the back of the room, and his family. He's the great-grandfather. No, he's the grandfather, comparable to me. My grandfather pastored the church for several years, and then later the Reverend Robert Bainham, our own Reverend Bainham here, also pastored this congregation. Humboldt already has many of its Civil War relevant sites included in the Freedom Frontier National Heritage Area, and the site of Aunt Polly's log cabin is already included. However, the church edifice itself should also be included in the heritage area, because doing so would help us to understand how the later African American community of this small town was so linked to Native American history in that town, but more importantly, in the streams of history that had united blacks and Indians over the course of many, many decades and many epic stories. So, the broader American history that those streams reflect and feed into link the Indians and the blacks who came into Kansas as part of the Great Escape and its aftermath. And all of that then would be part of what we would commemorate if we can include the church edifice itself in the Freedom Frontier. Thank you. Now I want to show you some shots and photos. This is the current structure of the Poplar Grove Church. You see the front view here, front entry from the front side. I will show this sign. This used to be a pretty well installed sign giving the history of the founding of the church in 1879, but it has since been twice replaced. This is a general map of the town of Humboldt with the appropriate locations. This is the downtown section here over the lower left, Chamber of Commerce, City Hall, Fire Department, and so forth. But up here in the top right is the old colored community and the park. And Logtown used to be in this area. This is the Neosho River flowing along here. And right along in here were some tunnels into the cliff. This is the location of Aunt Polly Crosby's cabin, and a block away is the Stovall home, and then another couple of blocks from that is the location of the Poplar Grove Baptist Church today. But this is where the church community started, in her log cabin. And then they went into a hayloft down in here somewhere, and now over to their present location. These are the signs that are available now, the latest here, and one preceded it. It seems that each minister that has come in recent years has taken the old sign down and tried to put up a new one with his own name in it. So I guess that was the point of replacing them. Close up again, the river, the old park. This is where the Indian Home Guards bivouacked and outfitted when they were marching from Neosho Falls over to Missouri for their first engagement, just 3 days after they had been organized. That's in March of 1862. And again, the riverbank, Polly's cabin, the Stovall home. I'll show you some other pictures close up of those locations. This is the Stovall home today, and this marker here is where the old cabin was for not only one of the Underground Railroad assistance areas, but also Kumsey's home. Sarah Kumsey was one of the first founders. Again, the Stovall home from the side. This is part of the plaque on Aunt Polly's log cabin marker for the Freedom Frontier. Again, part of the Stovall home. And then this is the new sign in front of the church, organized in 1879 by D.D. Payne. But as I pointed out, it was in Aunt Polly's cabin, and that's where they had preceded the organization for several decades. This is the marker for the old colored church, log town, where the Indian Home Guards bivouacked in this region. The river is over here behind it. Here is an example of caves still in the bluffs along that river, about 2 blocks, a block and a half from where Polly's cabin was located. Here's another further away on the other side of the river, showing the